Thanks everybody for coming out tonight. Someone opens a book. They read. Letters, words, and sentences unspool and begin to work their strange magic on the reader, dissolving this quotidian world with its workaday worries. The enchantment of language conjures a strange and mysterious land, which, as the reader reads on, only grows more mysterious, each page unfolding new complexities, each revelation opening new gaps, each new scene introducing new characters, each new character bearing their own unfolding and unfinished story. The world of the book compels our readers so powerfully, in fact, that they actually go to the place they're reading about, leaving home, crossing the sea, subjecting themselves to unimagined discomforts and unforeseen dangers, seeking to touch and taste and feel the mythic truth behind their word-induced dream. Does it even exist? Is it even real? Of course it's real, but never quite how you pictured it. The reader finds themselves disoriented, entangled in confusions and misunderstandings, drawn deeper and deeper into a harrowing spiritual ordeal, caught in the grip of empires and history and bitter sectarian feuds, and then, at last, adrift so far from home, gripped and possessed by terrifying spirits. Are they ghosts? Are they angels? Spirits who can only be appeased by being read to, by being written. If you're a fan of Sofia Samatar's work, you might recognize something in what I've described in her first novel, A Stranger in Olondria. Or you might also have thought of her memoir, The White Mosque. Both books describe ambiguous spiritual adventures to distant lands inspired by the act of reading, by the perilous and foolhardy desire to reach across space and time and bring the dead to life. A Stranger in Olondria, which won the William L. Crawford Award, the British Fantasy Award, and the World Fantasy Award, and was also a finalist for the Nebula and Locus Award for the best first novel, tells the story of Jevik, a Pedper merchant's son, taught to read and raised on stories of faraway Olondria to help his father's business. But Jevik falls in love with Olondria. And after his father dies, he travels there, filled with wonder and delight, only to find himself trapped by ghosts, angels, heresies, civil war, trapped by stories he can no longer escape or control. The White Mosque, which won the 2023 Bernard J. Brommel Award for biography and memoir, and was a finalist for the 2023 Penn Gene Stein Book Award, tells of Samatar's own journey to Uzbekistan, inspired by what else but books, following the trail of a group of German-speaking Mennonites who traveled from Russia to Central Asia on an apocalyptic quest to meet the anticipated return of the Son of God. As we follow Samatar deeper and deeper into the deserts and steppes and mountains of Central Asia, we ourselves are drawn deeper and deeper into a complex lyric meditation on commitment, community, spiritual yearning, history, and the power of the written word. These are only two of Samatar's several books, which include another novel, a book of short stories, and most recently a collaborative literary study written with Kate Zambreno, Tone, and will soon be joined next year by a science fiction novella, The Practice, the Horizon, and the Chain from Tor.com, and another collaborative work with Zambreno from Soft Skull Press. Samatar's work is widely admired for its lyricism, its densely imagined worlds, its breadth of scope, and its deep ethical and imaginative concern for the relationship between readers, writers, and texts. But one of the things I admire most about her work is that as much as it celebrates and glorifies glories in the written word, it also understands the hazards, risks, and complicities of reading and writing. Philosophers, poets, and literary scholars have long explored the ambivalent impact of literacy on human culture and human cognition. Anthropologists and historians have shown how literacy and empire go hand in hand. And recently, neuroscientists have begun to identify how learning to read physically changes the composition and organization of the brain, leading to observable changes in psychology and behavior. Reading and writing, as we know and avow here in this temple of words, are fundamental tools of human liberation, connection, and communication. But we also have to come to terms with how the written word is at the same time a tool of oppression, violence, and self-delusion. Like Rilke's angels, like the ghost in A Stranger in Olondria, like the apocalyptic texts inspiring Klaus Epp Jr. and his Mennonites, literature in Samatar's hands reveals both its beautiful and its terrifying aspects. Its uncomfortable, transformative power, its unpredictable and revolutionary capacity to warp and transmute worlds. I'm extremely pleased to welcome Sofia Samatar tonight to inaugurate the Kelly Community Reading Series. This series, begun now, tonight, in 2023, thanks, and supported by John and Patrice Kelly, has been established to strengthen connections between the literary and scholarly communities at Notre Dame and the broader South Bend, Mishawaka community, to celebrate the history and complexity and liberatory power of the written word, and to bring diverse voices together in the ongoing conversation that is global literature. I want to take a moment to thank the Kellys, the Department of English at the University of Notre Dame, the College of Arts and Letters, and especially our partners here at the St. Joseph County Public Library, namely Tyler Flores and Mac Anderson. I also want to thank Paul Cunningham, our program manager, for all his hard work organizing this event, and Joyelle McSweeney, who made the initial invitation, and Brain Layer Books, who have books for sale outside in the lobby, where after the event, Sophia will be signing books. If you choose to buy one and get it signed, please support your local bookstore. I also want to take a quick moment to honor our MFA students who are working to bring creative writing courses, tutoring, and literary programming out into the community at the Center for the Homeless, the Robinson Community Learning Center, here at the St. Joseph County Public Library, and elsewhere, particularly Ryan Fong and Isabel Boudiette, who are this year's Community Outreach Fellows. Yeah. I'm really proud of them and the work they're doing. Coming back to Samatar, I can think of no better writer to kick off this community reading series than our guest, who is not only an award-winning fantasy writer and memoirist, but a brilliant and insightful essayist and critic, a scholar and teacher of African literature, Arabic literature, and speculative fiction at James Madison University in Virginia, where she is Roop Distinguished Professor of English, and a Hoosier. That's right, that's right. Sofia Samatar was born in northern Indiana, not far from here, to Mennonite Muslim parents, went to a Mennonite high school, and earned her BA at Goshen College. Woo! She later earned a PhD in Arabic literature at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, spent several years teaching English in South Sudan and Egypt, and of course went on to become a famous and justly celebrated writer. But I like to think, if it's not too fantastic, that maybe it all started in a place like this, in a library like this, with a young reader taking a curiously titled book from the shelf, opening the cover, and finding herself dizzyingly, perilously, and wondrously transported and transformed. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Sofia Samatar.
Test, test. Are we on? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much, Roy, for that amazing introduction. That was just fantastic. I'm really pleased to be here. Thank you, all of you, for coming out this evening. I want to send my thanks also to the Kelly family for supporting and initiating this endeavor. All the folks at Notre Dame Creative Writing who have been amazing hosts and organizers, Paul Cunningham, Roy Scranton, Johannes Goranson, Joyelle McSweeney. It's really been a pleasure spending time with you for a couple days. And of course, the people at the library, Tyler Flores, Mac Anderson. It's just, I've really been honored and excited to be with you and to kick off this series. And so as you can see, I have this title for tonight called A Journey Toward Memoir. So I am talking about memoir, and but I'm talking about it as a memoir beginner because most of my writing is in fantasy and science fiction. And so not only fiction, but also like not even in this world. So for me to write a memoir was a real shift, and it was a real challenge. So a couple of things that I have in mind to do this evening. One is to sort of introduce you to this book and talk a little bit about what it's about. And another is to give a kind of behind the scenes into like how did it actually get written, and what were some of the difficulties, the problems that came up. And I want to do that partly because through writing this memoir, I came to think of memoir as like the most open genre. Like if you're alive, that's really if you're alive and literate, like there you go. Like those are the criteria for writing a memoir. That's all you need. Because if you're alive, then you have a life story. And so I'm interested in talking a bit about that. And then I would love to open things up at the end for some conversation, questions, and I'm very happy, in the Q&A, even though I'm talking about the memoir, if people have questions about the fantasy and science fiction, I'm certainly happy to answer, try to answer any kind of question that you think I might be able to answer, and we'll see how it goes. So this is, in some ways, it makes sense for a writer of the fantastic to be inspired by a story like the one behind the White Mosque, because this is the kind of thing that you can't make up, or I couldn't have made it up anyway. The story, the history, the true story of a group of Mennonites from southern Russia, what's now Ukraine, who went to Central Asia, what's now Uzbekistan, in the 1880s, and had a small German-speaking village there that lasted for 50 years. When I found out about this, I was like, what? Because I grew up Mennonite. I had a Mennonite education. I went to a Mennonite high school, Mennonite college, and I was like, I've never heard of these people. What is happening? And I became so obsessed with it that I wound up going to Uzbekistan in 2016 on a Mennonite heritage tour of Uzbekistan, in case you didn't know that exists. It does. And it's still going. Yeah, I think they just went like a couple months ago again. And it was a wonderful experience, and it, I had already wanted to write about the story, so then my trip became part of my own thinking about this history, and eventually became the story of this memoir. So the memoir starts, I'm in Tashkent, I've just landed, and I'm about to go on this trip, following the path that these people took in the 19th century. So I want to start by just like a taste of the book. So the book is written in a series of sections. They're often fairly short, sometimes half a page, sometimes a couple pages. So I'm just going to start by reading you the very first one so you can hear how the book opens. You will also see a few pictures, and if they look kind of not that great, it's because I took them. And if they look really nice and professional, it's because somebody else took them. So this is the beginning, the first section, and it's called Begin with the Glow. Begin with the glow, the faint beam of a half-forgotten history. In this darkened hotel room, a trace of ochre outlines the curtains. Push them aside, and a fawn-colored radiance blooms against my arms, revealing the city below, the dust and juniper trees, the loops of traffic. The light seems to flow from the streets as much as the sky, a tint in the air, less a brightness than a universal softening of the atmosphere. It appears to have no single source. It arrives everywhere at once, from all the ends of the earth, from the future and the past. Rumpled sheets, silky patterned walls, a decorative chair in the corner, rigid and remote, like a lady in waiting. I've traveled before, as a tourist, a student, a volunteer English teacher, but never for research, never as a pilgrim. Outside, a bus called Golden Dragon, tree trunks painted white, the heat of June, and the vastness of Tashkent, its miles of tended parks, the giant mosques that seem akin to the lonely Soviet structures, buildings marooned in the sky, much taller than the trees. The larger everything is, the smaller I feel, the more I sense the glow. My insignificance brings me close to stray, discarded things, to the story that brought me here, to this blade of grass I pluck by the statue of Amir Timur, the conqueror, guarded by angels, born with his fist full of blood. So that's the beginning. That's how we start. We're in Tashkent. And then, of course, this raises the question, like, why? What am I doing here? Why am I on this trip? And so I want to read another section that gets into that and talks about how I wound up in Uzbekistan. And this section is called Beautiful Error. What brought me here? In a way, I've arrived by accident. I'm haunted by a little piece of history, the story of a small, hardy, stubborn group of people who traveled here more than 100 years ago. I am haunted by a photograph of their church, blanched with whitewash, standing among the poplars of an arid village square. When I first saw it, I imagined its thick walls were made of crystal, that its surface would taste of salt, and that it could contain more than was physically possible, like a word. Because I saw this church in a photograph, I felt I could hold it in my hand. Because the photograph was a century old, I felt I was holding my century, the one in which I was born, the 20th century. Because the church was located in Central Asia, in what is now Uzbekistan, a place I had never seen and of which I knew practically nothing, I felt it was very foreign. Because the church was a Mennonite church, belonging to my own denomination, the faith tradition of my mother's family, I felt it was very close. To be very close to the very foreign is one definition of haunting. As the most prominent landmark of the village where it stood, the church in the photograph gave the place its name, Akhmechet, the White Mosque. To the local population, largely Muslim, the church was a white mosque. Beautiful error, radiant mistake. Whether one is Christian or Muslim or neither, churches and mosques form nodes of powerful feeling. Passions cluster about them. Some perceive them as violently opposed, charged in such a way that they must repel one another. Others would place them together as representatives of the same monotheistic, extremist, world-conquering impulse. But whether you see the forces these places emit as wildly different in character, generating worldviews that can never touch, or whether you see them as unified at a deep level, amplifying one another in a sizzling sibling rivalry, or whether your opinion partakes of both notions, I'm in this electrical storm. My mother's family are Swiss-German Mennonites, my father's Somali Muslims. I stand amid this lightning, which, here in the 21st century, only seems to be growing more intense. And so I wished to go inside the church that was a mosque. Its simplicity, its almost blinding pallor. The church crumbled decades ago. It no longer exists. A pilgrimage, then, to error, to ghosts, to the accidental, to the glow. So this is what takes me on this trip. And most of the people who were on this tour with me were actually descended from the Mennonites who settled in Akmetchet, which makes sense. That's why they were taking the trip. But I'm not descended from those people. My family is Mennonite, but I don't have any kind of biological connection to these folks. But for me, it was this story of Mennonite-Muslim interaction in the 19th century that I had never heard about, that seemed to be this strange sort of mirror of things that were very familiar to me and to my own story. So that's what kind of generated this the interest in this trip for me. And a lot of it, a lot of that desire to explore that story came from having, grown up with a kind of outsider feeling of being someone who's kind of like, people are a little confused, like what, have actually been asked, like, what are you? People don't say that as much anymore, but people used to ask, what are you? I'm like, I am, a two-headed snake from the planet Venus, But it's from being kind of like ethnically ambiguous, difficult to read, a name that people are like, we can't really tell what that name is, and so, for me, it was coming out of a desire to kind of synthesize and bring together these different parts of the story to sort of show that you can exist in this state of being between things or belonging to very different traditions. This does not make your existence like impossible, right? So seeing the story of these Mennonite folks who went and had, by all accounts, a harmonious, 50 years in a Muslim Khanate, I was like, wow, these people really knew how to synthesize different things and how to make it work. So that's kind of what took me to the story and wanting to study it. Now, as you can tell, this is already not maybe your most typical memoir, because it's not like, this is, who I am and my life, but it's also telling a history. So it's doing a couple of different things at once. Indeed, it is doing many different things at the same time, because as I continued researching, anything I found that was particularly interesting, I was like, oh, I want to write about that. So, I found that, for example, the poet Langston Hughes was traveling in Central Asia around in the 1930s at the same time as this Mennonite crew was there. And in fact, his book of poems, The Weary Blues, was the first American book to be published in Uzbek translation. And I was like, what? Who knew that? So then there had to be a Langston Hughes chapter, and there had to be, so there, if you ask me the question, what is this book about? I have to say something like this. So what is it about? Well, it's about Mennonites. It's about apocalyptic visions, right? The idea that the world is going to end. it's about this particular Mennonite story, this particular migration in the 1880s, Mennonite-Muslim interactions, missionaries, photography, colonialism, travel writing, attending Mennonite schools as a black kid, because all of a sudden I go and talk about, my high school experience. Langston Hughes, the stage and film actor Irene Worth, who was a very famous London stage actor, and she was descended from these Mennonites in Central Asia. Murders, hospitality, the astronomer Ulugh Beg, who was a 15th century Central Asian astronomer, got very interested in him. The photographer Hudaybergen Divanov, who had a connection to the Mennonites and was the first is called the father of Uzbek cinema and photography. Settler culture, Central Asian cinema, Mennonite writing, identity, and actually the list could probably continue and go on. So any life is complicated. Yours is just as bad. Don't think that mine would be so, no, your life is also super complicated and full of all kinds of things. And a big question often for a memoirist is what to put in and what to leave out. Because a memoir is not the same as an autobiography. An autobiography, you expect it to sort of begin with the birth and then go on through the person's life. But a memoir is not, can have different relationships to time. So a memoir could be, you could write a whole book about an experience that lasted, for 2 weeks, like this trip, but then you remember and bring in other things. It could be a weekend. You could have a whole memoir that really is based on a very short time in your life, or just the times in your life when you were in contact with a particular person. It could be I knew this person and didn't see them for 15 years and saw them again, and you might just skip the whole 15 years that's in the middle, because that's what because your memoir is about this relationship. So it's a really tricky thing to work with. It's how do I work with this material? How do I make it make sense? And what belongs and what doesn't belong? And my sense of what belongs was just as with all of my books, actually, if I really like it, then it belongs. That's the test. Is do I love it? Well, then, it should be in there. But I thought to give you that little behind-the-scenes piece, I would show you the very first table of contents of the White Mosque, and then the final table of contents. And this is a book that took 7 years to write, so it went through very many drafts and many different things happened to it. So when we start, this is the first table of contents. It looks like this. There's a section, the first section is called the bride community, and it's fiction. It's not even nonfiction. It is me taking an imaginary, I made up a character. I imagined this woman who had been on this journey, and I wrote 3 chapters of her story, and it's fiction. So you start like that. Then there's a section that's about Mennonite martyrs and writing and identity. Then we go to a section on colonialism and photography. Then we talk about missionaries, these Mennonites in Central Asia, and then my high school experience is there as well. And then the final chapter was called Khiva Notebook. So Khiva is the province of Uzbekistan where these folks settled. And that final chapter was the story of my trip to Uzbekistan. So it was only one chapter, and it came at the very end. And so it was a totally different book. And wow, it was not working. You can probably tell why at a glance, but for some reason, it took me years to figure out, 6 years to figure out what is the problem here. Well, I figured out the problems one by one. The first problem that I figured out was okay, you're starting with basically historical novel. Well, that's kind of a rude awakening for the reader who thinks that they've just picked up a historical novel. And there's a character, and they're following the character. And then your girl is gone. She disappears. She doesn't come back for the rest of the whole book. And an unsuspecting reader, innocently picking up this book, is going to feel maybe a little cheated, that like I thought I was reading a novel, and then there was this woman, and then she was gone, and then it's just all these like essays about colonialism and photography, like what is happening? So that was simply because I had never written a nonfiction book before, I had never written memoir before, and I was a little bit hiding behind the fiction, is what I was doing, because it was scary to actually just write about myself in my own voice after being in other worlds and other, realities in my fiction. And so it was almost like a crutch. Like I just went to fiction because it was comfortable, but I later realized it doesn't belong in this book. The other problem is that this table of contents is just like stuff beside each other. Like an essay on this, an essay on that. It's a collage, and I actually love collage, both visual and in writing. I think it's a completely legitimate form. But I found myself reading over this draft and thinking, and everybody knew, like my agent was like, it wasn't just me, it was, everybody was like, this is not really working. We were sending it to editors and they were all like, and actually it was interesting when because we did send this, my agent tried to sell this version, or I guess we had taken the fiction out, but tried to sell this kind of collage version. And everybody was like, no. And the feedback I got was like the opposite. So half the editors said, we want more of her. We want more of Sofia. Like, where is Sofia in this? It's too much history. And the other half of the people said, there's not enough history. Like, we need more background. We need more history. And I always think when that happens, like when when you get the opposite advice, the problem is not either of those things. The problem is something else, and nobody can quite articulate what the problem is. But I eventually realized in reading over the draft that the problem was there's no forward motion. When you finish a chapter, it's like an essay on that topic is complete. Why would you turn the page and go on to the next thing? Like, there's no, like, why would I go? And I thought, this is so weird. This book feels so static. It just feels like there are these pieces that are sitting there, and it's not moving, it's not going anywhere. Why does it feel like it's not moving when it's literally about a journey? It's about the Mennonite journey from point A to point B. It's about my journey to Uzbekistan. Why does it feel like it's not moving? And then I went, oh, that's what I have to do. This final piece, that's the book. There you go. You're making that motion. Like, that's exactly it. I need to take this and I need to spread it out through the whole book and then insert all the other stuff inside it. And that's what I wound up doing, and that's what became the book. So now what does the table of contents look like? So now the table of contents is attached to place. So it starts in Tashkent, that part I read. We go to the Hunger Steppe, we go to Samarkand, and these are kind of the themes that are coming up. Then there's a section, Kok Ota is a village that we visit. We go to Bukhara, we cross the desert, and we have these topics. And then finally, we get to Khiva, we get to Akhmetchet, which used to be the Mennonite village, and then we're in Tashkent because my trip is over and I'm about to fly back home. So it kind of makes a circle, beginning and ending in Tashkent, and we have these topics kind of woven in there. And a big difference with this part is that you can locate it somewhere. The other version was just like ideas floating in space. Who is having these ideas? Where is she? Does she have a body? What's going on with her? All of these were questions you could not answer in the first version. And so what I learned, again, seems like something I should have already known, but there's something about this kind of life writing that really asks for a grounding. We want to know that there is, that this person that's talking to us has a body and is in a place and have those kind of details of place in the work. read one more section that demonstrates a little bit this kind of blending together of my story and the history that I'm telling, which is kind of the way that I tell the story in the book. So I'm gonna read this section, and then I'll that'll be it for this part, and then I'll open it up for and welcome any questions or conversation to follow. So I'm going to read from the section from Wanderers, from part 1. This section is called Shadows of Earthly Things, and it starts to tell the story of these Mennonites. And you will meet in here, there's a guy called Frank. He's the leader of the tour, because I'm on this tour bus while this is happening. So he's our leader. And you will also hear the name of Franz Bartsch, who was a man who went on this journey, one of these Mennonites, who wrote a memoir. Because this book is also a blend of memoirs, because I had about 5 different memoirs of people who had been on this trip and who had written about their experiences. And I was using those to kind of reconstruct the journey. So you'll hear his name as well. Wanderers. They left their farms in Russia, the untracked settlement, the villages nestling in the valleys, the bubbling creek Tarlich. In his memoir of the trek, Franz Bartsch records the death of his infant daughter, who succumbed to a sudden fever on the eve of the migration. Then we went to the cemetery, where we took leave of our little one. They buried her at dawn on a summer day in 1880. By 10 o'clock, Bartsch and his wife were on their way to Central Asia with a group that would become known as the Bride Community. They were sojourners and pilgrims. They were Germans from the Volga, they would explain to people they met along the way, who were seeking a place where they could practice their faith. They were leaving Russia, for the Tsar had revoked the law that exempted them from military service. All over the Mennonite settlements there, people were selling their farms and moving away, most going west to the Americas. But these, raising the dust with their line of 18 covered wagons, had chosen a different path, a more dazzling vision. It was a vision of the end of the world. For decades, millenarian fever had been rippling across Europe, intensified by a series of populist revolutions that were seen by some as the footprints of Antichrist. One of these prophets was the Mennonite preacher, Klaus Epp Jr. He urged the faithful to abandon the West with its sick, collapsing empires and take refuge in the free wilderness of the East, in the desert, like the woman clothed with the sun in the book of Revelation. The moon under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars. There they would await the second coming. Through his study of Revelation and the book of Daniel, Epp predicted Christ's return with increasing precision until he reached a date, March 8, 1889. Franz Bartsch, a teacher, had at first been skeptical of Epp's prophecies, but had gradually become one of his most loyal followers. He was in the first wagon train, the Corps, made up of families who had attended a special communion service led by Epp. There they had bound themselves together with ties of love and destiny. They had shared in the new ceremony of foot washing. They had given up the formal German pronoun, Sie, and addressed one another as Du. They were turned toward the future, when they would meet Christ, their bridegroom, in Central Asia. I see them setting off in their covered wagons, a line of futurists, of idealists. There were more children than adults. Several sympathetic friends accompanied them part of the way, and a woman left them some fresh cream waffles on a stump. Klaus Epp, too, was there, though he would soon return to the settlement to encourage others to undertake the journey. At the place of the 3 wells, a place which, Bartsch writes, remained deeply engraved in our memories, Epp gave a sermon called Shadows and Essence. He used Hebrews 8:5, a text on the shadow of heavenly things. A document, I think, is a shadow of earthly things. I read Franz Bartsch in the morning, in a pale light barred by the lines between the windows, as the bus rolls down a highway lined with farms. An open landscape, dun and green, basking in the heat. Mounds of yellow clay piled up where they have been cleaning the canal. The houses are gray brick with roofs of corrugated iron, sometimes painted, so they make quilt-like squares of lavender, orange, maroon. In the shade of a copse, black sheep clump together, richly colored like handfuls of dates. All movement seems slow compared to the rush of our bus. The old men in white caps chatting together on wobbling bicycles piled with clover, the boy pushing a cart of bottled water, the trotting donkeys. This is Franz Bartsch's atmosphere, this his light. I read his memoir here, and I listen to it too, for Frank, our historian and tour leader, has the same books I do, the ones layered in my suitcase. He reads aloud from them into the microphone. He reads Bartsch's description of everyday things, the covered wagon, the samovar packed inside, the spring-filled cushion on the box. This is what we want to know. I can sense Frank's excitement, the historian's alertness to those small details that clarify the past. There is no sermon, no theological argument that can make a moment suddenly come together in this way. The way Bartsch draws us close, writing of the tin ladle, the pails hanging on hooks, and the lopsided wagon cover, so poorly made, its thin struts buckling like leather. And I'm going to stop there. Thank you so much for your attention. To take any, questions, things you want to ask about. Again, could be about memoir, but doesn't have to be. Happy to engage with whatever you would like to bring. Oh, and are we using the mic? Is that the plan?
There's a mic here, and then... Oh,
Yep, for anyone with questions, please feel free to step up to the mic. If there are any mobility issues, I can bring this one to you.
Start while everyone's thinking of questions. I just is curious, a thought that I had, and there's a lot of questions I have about your book and your process and so on. But what I'm going to ask is, has anyone from your bus tour read this, and have you heard from them and what they thought about it?
Thank you. Well, as I learned, there's a real difference of opinion on this within the memoir writing community. There are memoirists who are like, yes, if you're writing about someone, if they show up in your book as a character, they're recognizable and all of those things, then you should show it to them. And there are other people who are like, no, that's the last thing you should do. Don't show it to them. I have a buddy, for example, who wrote a very beautiful memoir about his mother and did not show it to her because he knew that she would be very unhappy with it, which is just what happened. And he said, it was very important for him that the thing be printed, it's distributed, it's in the library, it's in the bookstore, like it's not going anywhere, Mom. And so for him, it was like he really needed, it was almost like the book was his support to say like his story mattered, his version of events mattered, right? And so he needed it out in the world before she even knew that it was being written. I went the other way, partly, just because because I don't know, I feel like it would be very difficult for me emotionally to know that someone was unhappy with something I'd written about them and it was too late for me to change it. That's how I felt. And so I sent it to my mom and my in-laws and this one uncle that I write about, and everybody that was on the trip got a copy of the manuscript, because I was like, I'd rather have you tell me now than while I can still change it. And, you know, I just said, look, folks, you don't have a lot of time. You don't have to read this whole book. You know, your name is Frank in there. So just like do your search for Frank and see everything I say about Frank and see if you're, you know, happy about it or not. And it was actually fine. I didn't get a lot, I mean, they were very, you know, people were excited because they were like, oh, I didn't even like remember all those things that happened, and it's great I have this book. It's like, you know, a scrapbook of the trip or something. I did have, you know, sometimes just, you know, just details I'd gotten wrong. You know, like one woman who was, you know, I said she was Mennonite on her mother's side, and she's like, no, I'm Mennonite on my father's side. Okay, no problem. There was one case where somebody asked me to take something out. Said, I'm not comfortable with this thing being in there, and it was something that he had said, and I had not identified him by name, and there were very few details, but he said, I prefer that not be in there. And I looked at the section that it was in, and I realized that, you know, I can say what I'm saying. Like, I don't need this anecdote about what he said in order to say what I'm saying. So I was like, yeah, no problem. And I took it out. Yeah, thanks for the question.
I have a question. So, for anyone who might be curious about that first draft where you had the fiction opening, have you considered potentially continuing it or maybe including it in a collection of stories in the future, or is it now just kind of in the vault?
That's a very interesting question. So it is not going to appear in the world, but that's because everything that was really good about it has been dismantled and pulled apart and reappropriated and is actually in the memoir. Because how did I write that fiction piece? I wrote it based on the memoirs of these people that I was reading, who had experienced this trek, this journey. And so instead of taking the details from their memoirs and blending them into a fictional character, I wound up simply quoting them. Like, just let them speak for themselves. And so, you know, all the things that I wanted to say in that fiction piece about the climate, about the experience, about the things that happened to them, those things are still in there, but they're now told, you know, in the voices of those people, which I actually think is much, you know, richer and better and more exciting than what I had done with this fiction experiment. So yeah, so all the good stuff is in the book. It's just not in that fictionalized form. Yeah, thanks for that.
Hi again. I was just wondering how you feel about how your religious experience plays into like how you write.
That's very interesting. Well, I am very lapsed myself, and so there's a sense in which the most important and central otherworldly experience that I have is reading and writing. So you could say weirdly that, I mean, there's a couple different ways to look at that, I guess, and one of them would be that art, in a sense, has the place in my life that religion might hold in someone's life, in a very similar, you know, parallel that you know, it's the other space. It's the space where time works differently is the space of the eternal, and it's the space of experiences that are, that are extremely fulfilling and crucial, and are detached from the kind of everyday, like workaday world. And having said that, I really like church, and I still go to church, and I love that. There are a lot of things I love about it, from people, community, singing, experience, and chances to do organizing, actually, through the church. But I don't feel, how people will be like, I'm not religious, but I am spiritual. I'm the opposite. I'm like, I'm not spiritual, but I'm religious. I like the religious part, but the spiritual, I'm like, So it doesn't, for me, that's not where it is, that if I can call it any kind of, like a metaphysical something, is not happening through a church experience, but it is definitely happening through the experience of art and through the experience of reading and writing. It's kind of really where it is for me. Yeah, thanks for that.
If anyone has a question but does not want to come up to the mic, feel free to raise your hand and I will bring a mic to you.
What was your process in sort of unlearning how to write fiction and learning how to write memoir? Like, what were you reading? What were you researching? I'm sure that was a difficult transition between drafts. So what was your process?
Yeah, thank you. It was difficult because it's really scary to be like, it's me. Like when you're used to having all these other characters and people that you can, it's very frightening to put yourself in that space. And I read memoirists, I read nonfiction writing. A big favorite of mine is a book called The Possessed by Elif Batuman, which is awesome, and it's about it's really about weird academics who love Russian literature. But in it, she also spends some time in Uzbekistan. And I love that book because it manages to do so many things at once, in that you can feel the voice of a person. She's genuinely talking to you, but she's not doing anything that is like me or showy. Like it's like it's writing about the self that doesn't feel self-centered. And I really love that because her interest is in Russian literature, and so that's what she's writing about, but through her own experiences. So that was a big one for me. I really love that book. And let me think. It was weird. I actually was slow to read memoirs. Like I worked on it was like 6 years working on this book, and then I was like, gosh, maybe I should read some memoirs. And like, see what people are doing. How are they doing this? I know that Rebecca Solnit was another writer that I was reading that I really liked, especially a book of hers called The Faraway Nearby, because of what she does with structure in that book. She has a really interesting way of putting the words together, or putting the sections and kind of themes together. I love the memoir Running in the Family by Michael Ondaatje, which is about his super strange family growing up in Sri Lanka. Because it's quirky, because it's beautifully written. So those were some of the things I read that made me feel like, yeah, I could do this. But I think the one about the Elif Batuman one is that it's that voice, like her voice is so clear and forthright, and it's not trying to be lyrical even or anything. It's just like it sounds like it's really her. She's speaking, and it felt very fearless to me because it wasn't trying to be arty. It was just a person talking. So that impressed me, and I tried to extract some of her confidence through reading that book many times. Yeah.
You feel like learning this other way of writing and
question is, has learning this other way of writing in the memoir, has that changed the way that I write fiction? And I think it has. I think maybe it's not so much a change as an addition. Like it's added this other thing that I feel I'm able to do, which is just go into a voice that's like, hey, you know, it's here I am, and I'm just talking. And I'm not, there's nothing I need to add. There doesn't have to be anything fancy about this. Sometimes if you have something really powerful, if you're about to say something that's really powerful and important, sometimes you can even obscure it with the sort of, you know, beauty of magic prose. It can be like, it's actually interfering with just like, hey, I need to say this. And so I find that even if I'm writing fiction now, like characters are more likely to have those moments of just, you know, because even my characters often in the fiction had, you know, it was part of to me, the beauty of how the story was constructed, and so even, you know, the dialogue was part of that, and now I feel like I have more, maybe different kinds of, or at least this very forthright way of speaking has sort of been added to the fiction that I'm doing, yeah. I'm just about to ask if there are more questions.
Yeah, I wanted to ask one more.
Okay,
About,
maybe there's a different one.
All right. About it's sort of inarticulate, but I'll do my best. About writing and your sense of place and the way that I was thinking about. You were talking in the conversation yesterday about writing Stranger in Olondria in South Sudan, and like there's like you had no internet, you had no TV, like nothing else going on, and so it's this escape, right? Kind of as escapist. I mean, I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean, like it's this alternate dimension that, and yet it reflects where you're at, and there's some kind of relationship there, but it's transmuted, it's transformed. But then this, right? You know, this is like you're there, and so I don't know. I just I guess moving into the nonfictional, in the realm of nonfiction, and kind of writing about place and travel, like, has that shifted the relationship that you had between like experience and place and what you put on the page?
Yeah.
If that, yeah.
It does, yeah, that's an interesting question. And I would say that it's less a matter of a shift than a matter of recognition. And recognizing, you know, as you like pointed out in the wonderful introduction, that like my first book is a travelogue, and this most recent book is also a travelogue. Like even though one is in a fantasy world that I made up, and one of them is in this world this path that I physically went on, they're both very much about travel, they're both very much about place, and most importantly, they are about experience. They are about the experience of the senses, the sensory experience of the world. And that, I think, there's been a recognition for me that no matter what I'm writing, no matter what I'm reading, that's what I'm looking for. Because, you know, it's sort of in that last section that I read, like, you can make an argument, you can make an essay. Those are very powerful kind of forms of rhetoric and forms of communication. But to give somebody the sense of having had an experience, what you want are those sensory details. And that's true whether you are in Uzbekistan or Olondria, like whichever you're reading about, you want, you know, I think that I myself, at least as a reader, I go to the work to feel like I'm there, to feel like I'm in that place, and I want that. I want that kind of tactile. I want to smell what it's like. and I want to feel the air, the weather, the light. And I think more and more that's sort of, I'm explicitly reading for that. I'm looking for that when I read and when I write. Yeah. Thank you for that. And thank you everyone so much for being here.